Good evening, and welcome back. Before we begin, allow the world beyond this moment to grow wonderfully quiet. Close your eyes. Take one slow, deep breath. Inhale the calm, hold it for just a heartbeat, and gently exhale every worry that followed you through the day. Relax your shoulders, unclench your hands. Let your breathing become slow, steady, effortless. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else demanding your attention. Only the sound of my attention, only the sound of my voice, and a story carried through time, a story born on an ordinary spring evening that ended by changing the course of a nation forever. History often remembers a single gunshot, a famous face, a tragic date carved into monuments, textbooks. But history is rarely witnessed by history itself. It is witnessed by ordinary eyes, by people who never expected to stand beside destiny. Tonight, our story belongs not to a president, nor to a boy, too young to understand politics, yet old enough to remember one terrible sound for the rest of his life. His name was Samuel Brooks. He was 13 years old, and before the sun rose again, he would become the last living thread connecting an ordinary afternoon to one of America's darkest nights. Washington City, April 14th, 1865. The Civil War had all but ended after 4 endless years of bloodshed. Families spoke hopefully about peace again. Soldiers wandered the streets wearing faded blue uniforms instead of marching toward battle. Church bells rang longer than usual. Shopkeepers smiled more easily. Strangers greeted one another as though the city itself had survived a terrible illness. Samuel noticed none of the politics. He noticed newspapers, fresh ink, the weight of coins dropped into his small leather pouch. His entire world fit inside a stack of folded papers balanced beneath one arm. Every morning before sunrise, he helped his mother prepare breakfast in their tiny boarding house near Pennsylvania Avenue. His father had marched away with a Union regiment 3 years earlier and never returned. No official ever explained exactly where he fell. Only a single letter arrived, stained by rain, informing Mary Brooks that her husband had died serving the Union. From that day forward, Samuel became the man of the house, not because he was ready, because there was no one else. "Don't forget your coat," Mary called as he hurried toward the door. "The evenings are still cold." Samuel smiled without slowing. "I'll be back before midnight." "You always say that, and I always come home." Mary watched him disappear. Samuel's route never changed. He crossed Pennsylvania Avenue, weaving effortlessly between horse-drawn carriages and crowded sidewalks. Government clerks hurried toward offices carrying bundles of documents. Street musicians played cheerful tunes celebrating the end of the war. Vendors roasted chestnuts whose warm scent drifted through the cool spring air. "Extra! Extra!" Samuel's voice echoed confidently. "President Lincoln speaks of rebuilding the Union. Peace may finally be at hand." People purchased newspapers almost faster than he could unfold them. Hope sold well. Hope always had. Near midday, he stopped outside a cafe where soldiers gathered around wooden tables. One veteran waved him over. "Boy, what's today's biggest headline?" Samuel handed him a paper. "The president's going to Ford's Theater tonight." Another soldier laughed. "About time he took a night off. The man earned it." Samuel barely listened. To him, Abraham Lincoln was less a president than a familiar face. Tall, always wearing the same black coat, always surrounded by crowds, occasionally passing through the streets in an open carriage while people removed their hats in respect. Samuel had seen him only twice before. once from a distance, once close enough to recognize the sadness hidden behind the president's gentle smile. He wondered how a man celebrated across the nation could still appear. So to noon drifted toward evening. Washington grew livelier. Gas lamps flickered awake along the streets. Restaurants filled with laughter. Music escaped open windows. Everywhere people spoke about the performance scheduled for Ford's Theater. Our American Cousin, one of the city's favorite comedies. Even the president planned to attend. That single announcement transformed an ordinary performance into the event of the season. Evening settled gently over Washington, and for a little while, the city seemed untouched by the years of war that had scarred the nation. The warm glow from Ford's Theater spilled onto the cobblestone street, mixing with the flickering gas lamps that lined 10th Street. Elegant couples laughed as they entered the theater. Carriages rolled away one by one. Musicians somewhere down the avenue played a cheerful tune that drifted through the cool spring air. Samuel Brooks remained where he was. His newspapers were gone. He could have walked home. His mother expected him before midnight, yet something convinced him to stay. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the hope of catching another glimpse of the president, perhaps nothing more than the instinct of a boy who enjoyed watching important people pass by. He leaned against the brick wall and listened. From inside came waves of laughter. The audience loved the comedy. Even from outside, Samuel could hear the actors delivering their lines, followed by thunderous applause that escaped whenever the theater doors briefly opened. For a moment, America sounded happy again. Inside the theater, Abraham Lincoln sat in the presidential box beside Mary Todd Lincoln. Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris completed the small party. Lincoln looked exhausted, yet peaceful, perhaps more relaxed than he had been in years. The terrible burden of civil war finally seemed to be lifting. Friends later remembered that evening as one of the rare moments when Lincoln allowed himself to smile freely. He spoke softly to Mary. "When this is all over," his voice almost disappeared beneath the laughter from the stage, "we must travel." He dreamed of seeing California, of returning to Springfield, of living quietly after years spent carrying the weight of an entire nation. He believed there would finally be time. Fate had already decided otherwise. Several streets away, another man walked through the darkness with very different thoughts. John Wilkes Booth moved quickly toward Ford's Theater. To many Americans, he was a celebrated actor. To himself, he believed he was about to become something far greater. His boots struck the pavement with steady purpose. Inside his coat rested a small Derringer pistol. Sharp, simple, deadly. A long hunting knife hung beneath his jacket. Every step carried him closer to history, but not the kind he imagined. Booth convinced himself he was saving the South, saving liberty, saving the Constitution. Yet beneath every excuse lived something darker: pride, obsession, the desperate need to force the world to remember his name. Samuel noticed him only because he moved differently from everyone else. Most theatergoers entered laughing. Booth did not. His face remained calm, too calm. His eyes never wandered toward the crowd. They remained fixed upon the entrance. Samuel frowned for only a second, then shrugged. Actors often came and went through the theater. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed dangerous. The man disappeared inside. Samuel looked away. It would become the greatest regret of his life. Minutes passed, then more. The city remained peaceful. A horse snorted impatiently beside an empty carriage. The aroma of roasted chestnuts drifted from a nearby vendor. Somewhere across the street, a clock struck 10. Samuel stretched his tired legs. He wondered whether his mother was still awake. He should leave. Just one more minute. He told himself, one more. Inside the theater, Booth climbed the staircase leading toward the presidential box. He knew the building well. He had performed there many times. No one questioned his presence. No one searched him. No one imagined that a familiar actor climbing familiar stairs carried murder beneath his coat. The guard assigned to protect the president had quietly stepped away. The hallway stood empty. Booth reached the door. He listened. The audience erupted into laughter at one of the play's funniest lines. He smiled. He had chosen this exact moment. The laughter would hide the sound. Outside, Samuel heard the audience laughing harder than ever before. He smiled without knowing why. Then, everything changed. A single crack shattered the night. Not loud, not explosive, just one sharp report. Like a board snapping beneath sudden weight. The laughter stopped instantly. For one heartbeat, the city became perfectly still. Samuel frowned. Fireworks? No, too early. A stage effect? Perhaps. Then came a scream. Another. Then dozens. The peaceful theater transformed into chaos. People rushed toward the exits. Women cried out in terror. Men shouted conflicting orders. Someone screamed. The president. Another voice answered. They've shot the president. Samuel felt every muscle in his body freeze. No! Samuel could not move. His eyes remained fixed on the dark street where the rider had disappeared. The echo of pounding hooves lingering in the night long after the horse itself had vanished. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently that he wondered if everyone around him could hear it. Only moments earlier, the city had been laughing. Now every familiar sound had been replaced by cries, frantic footsteps, and the desperate voices of people trying to understand the impossible. The president has been shot. The word spread through the crowd faster than fire through dry timber. Each person repeated them with a different expression. Disbelief, horror, anger. No one wanted to believe them, yet everyone did. Samuel pushed against the rushing crowd. He was small enough to slip between frightened adults. His curiosity overwhelmed his fear. He reached the entrance of Ford's Theater just as soldiers forced people backward. Stay outside. No one enters. We need room. Inside, chaos echoed through every hallway. Women sobbed uncontrollably. Actors still wore their costumes, their painted smiles now transformed into masks of terror. A doctor hurried past Samuel, carrying a leather medical case. Another man shouted for blankets. Someone else demanded water. Every order collided with another until the entire theater seemed consumed by confusion. Samuel caught only fragments. Shot in the head. Still breathing. Find a surgeon. Every sentence tightened the knot in his stomach. Across the theater, Major Henry Rathbone leaned against a wall, his sleeve soaked in blood after trying to stop Booth. His face had become pale with shock, yet he continued describing the assassin to every officer who would listen. Dark hair, black coat. He escaped on horseback. The description spread immediately. Officers sprinted into the streets. Whistles pierced the night. Within minutes, cavalry patrols galloped through Washington, searching every intersection. The city had become a trap. At least, that was the hope. Samuel slipped outside once more. Pennsylvania Avenue no longer resembled the cheerful boulevard he had walked only hours earlier. Doors flew open. Families emerged carrying lanterns. Government officials raced through the streets without hats or coats. Church bells began ringing unexpectedly, not for celebration, for alarm. Their slow, heavy toll rolled across the sleeping city like distant thunder. People gathered in clusters beneath gas lamps. What happened? Is he alive? Who did it? Rumors multiplied with every passing minute. Some claimed Confederate soldiers had invaded Washington. Others whispered that several government leaders had been attacked at the same time. No one knew the full truth. Fear eagerly filled every empty space left by facts. Samuel suddenly remembered his mother. She would hear the bells. She would know something terrible had happened. She would think. He started running. His worn boots slapped against damp cobblestones as he hurried through streets filling with frightened citizens. Along the way, he saw soldiers establishing roadblocks. Every rider entering or leaving Washington faced immediate questioning. Telegraph operators rushed into government buildings. Their fingers danced across brass keys, sending urgent messages across the country. Assassinated. President critically wounded. Seal the roads. Find Booth. The entire nation seemed to awaken at once. Mary Brooks stood anxiously outside the boarding house when Samuel rounded the corner. She ran toward him before he could speak. "Oh, Samuel." She pulled him tightly into her arms. "I heard gunshots. People were running." I thought she couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel buried his face against her shoulder. "They shot President Lincoln." Mary froze. "No, I saw it happen." "You saw?" "I saw the man leave." His voice trembled for the first time that night. "I watched him right away." Mary looked into her son's eyes. Something had changed. Only hours earlier, they had held the careless curiosity of childhood. Now, they reflected something far older. No 13-year-old should ever carry. Neither of them slept. Like thousands across Washington, they remained awake beside the window. The streets outside never became quiet. Horsemen galloped past until dawn. Messengers carried sealed orders between military headquarters. Doctors came and went from the modest boarding house across from Ford's Theater where Lincoln had been carried after the shooting. Samuel learned that the president had never regained consciousness. He imagined the tall man who had smiled kindly from the carriage only hours earlier. Now, he lay motionless in a stranger's bedroom. An entire nation waited for him to open his eyes. Far beyond Washington, John Wilkes Booth rode hard into the Maryland countryside. Each painful stride of his horse sent fresh agony through his injured leg. Broken when he leaped from the presidential box, but pain meant nothing now. He believed he had become a hero. He expected church bells in the South, celebrations, glory. Instead, every farmhouse he passed closed its doors. Every traveler he encountered stared with suspicion. News traveled faster than horses. By sunrise, America no longer saw John Wilkes Booth as a celebrated actor. His name had become synonymous with treachery, and for the first time since pulling the trigger, a single terrifying realization crept into his thoughts. He had not saved a nation. He had awakened the fury of one. As dawn slowly painted the Washington sky in pale shades of gray, Samuel stared silently toward the distant rooftops. The announcement spread through Washington faster than the morning light. Before the sun had fully risen above the rooftops, every church bell in the capital rang with slow, mournful purpose. Their deep voices rolled across the city, through narrow streets, over government buildings, across the quiet lawns of the White House, until it seemed as though the entire nation had begun to grieve with a single heartbeat. Samuel stood beside his mother on the boarding house steps. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence around them carried more weight than any conversation ever could. Only yesterday people had celebrated the end of war. Now black ribbons appeared in windows. Flags were lowered. Strangers embraced one another openly in the streets. Even the birds seemed strangely absent from the morning sky. Government officials worked without rest. Inside the War Department, Secretary Edwin Stanton transformed grief into relentless determination. Seal every bridge. Question every witness. No delay. Telegraph wires hummed continuously as messages flashed across the country. John Wilkes Booth, armed, dangerous, captured dead or alive. Military patrols expanded outward like ripples across a lake. Every ferry crossing, every railroad station, every country road leading south became part of a growing net designed to catch one fleeing man. Yet Booth already held a precious advantage: time. Far beyond Washington, Booth rode through dense forests beside David Herold, the young accomplice who had chosen loyalty over conscience. Booth's broken leg had swollen terribly. Each movement sent waves of pain through his body. Still, he refused to surrender. "I did what had to be done," he muttered repeatedly. "They'll understand." But the world outside refused to match the story inside his own mind. Instead of cheers, he found silence. Instead of admiration, he encountered suspicion. At isolated farms where he begged for food and shelter, faces stiffened as fresh newspapers arrived. The headlines were impossible to ignore. President Lincoln assassinated, mourning across the nation. The actor who once lived for applause had become the most hated man in America. Back in Washington, investigators returned to Ford's Theater. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been cleaned. The theater remained frozen in the exact moment history had shattered it. Samuel watched from behind a police barricade as detectives climbed the narrow staircase toward the presidential box. One officer carefully measured footprints. Another recovered Booth's dropped hat. A small Derringer pistol rested where it had fallen after the shot. Tiny clues. Each one another piece of a deadly puzzle. Samuel stared toward the balcony. Only hours earlier he had watched President Lincoln smile from that very place. Now, soldiers guarded it as though it were sacred ground. Perhaps it had become exactly that. Late that afternoon, an officer approached the crowd outside. "Did anyone see the rider who fled?" Samuel hesitated. His mother gently squeezed his shoulder. "Go." The boy stepped forward. "I saw him." The officer knelt. "What did you notice?" Samuel closed his eyes. He forced himself to remember every detail. The horse was already waiting. He limped after he came out. He wore a dark coat. He never looked behind him. The officer wrote every word. "When did he leave?" "Right after everyone started screaming." The officer nodded slowly. "You may have helped us more than you know." Samuel watched him disappear into the growing network of investigators. For the first time, he understood that even an ordinary newspaper boy could change history simply by remembering what others overlooked. Days passed. The manhunt stretched across forests, rivers, tobacco farms, and hidden trails. Thousands of Union soldiers searched relentlessly. Rewards grew larger. Every newspaper carried Booth's portrait on the front page. Every citizen knew his face. Every knock at a farmhouse door inspired fear. Yet Booth continued slipping through the narrowing circle. His confidence slowly gave way to exhaustion. His injury worsened. Food became scarce. Sleep came only in brief moments beneath cold spring skies. For the first time since firing the fatal shot, Doubt entered his thoughts. Had he truly become a liberator, or merely a murderer running from justice? Meanwhile, Samuel returned to selling newspapers. Only now, every headline reminded him of the terrible night outside Ford's Theater. Read the latest. The assassin still at large. The nation mourns President Lincoln. People bought papers with trembling hands. Some cried while reading. Others stared silently before folding them beneath their arms. Washington no longer felt like the same city. Hope had vanished almost overnight. Even victory in war seemed distant compared to the grief that filled every street. Samuel noticed something else. Children spoke more quietly. Adults smiled less. History had not merely taken a president. It had stolen a nation's innocence. Then, nearly 2 weeks after the assassination, word arrived from Virginia. Union cavalry had finally surrounded a remote tobacco barn. Inside, John Wilkes Booth was trapped. No more roads, no more disguises, no more escape. Samuel stopped shouting his newspaper headlines as the crowd gathered around a telegraph office, waiting desperately for the next message. Inside that burning barn, the final chapter of the greatest manhunt in American history was about to unfold. The crowd outside the telegraph office hardly seemed to breathe. Every few minutes, another operator emerged carrying a fresh strip of paper, and dozens of anxious hands reached toward him before he could even speak. Samuel stood near the front, his cap clutched tightly between trembling fingers. The morning air was cool, yet sweat gathered across his brow. For nearly 2 weeks, the entire nation had followed the hunt, as though every mile of the pursuit belonged to them personally. Now, it was almost over. The message arrived just after sunrise. Cavalry has located Booth. A murmur swept through the crowd. Near Port Royal, Virginia, another pause, surrounded inside a tobacco barn. No one moved. Every face remained fixed on the operator. The silence itself seemed louder than the shouting that followed. The events unfolded hundreds of miles away, but through the telegraph they reached Washington, almost as quickly as thought itself. Union cavalry under Lieutenant Edward Doherty had tracked Booth and David Herold to the Garrett farm. The soldiers surrounded the weathered tobacco barn before dawn, rifles aimed at every possible exit. Lanterns flickered against the wooden walls as officers called into the darkness, "Surrender." Only one man answered, David Herold, shaking, terrified, exhausted. He stepped outside with his hands raised. Booth remained inside. "I will not be taken alive," he shouted. The words echoed through the silent fields. Even now, surrounded, wounded, abandoned, he still imagined himself the hero of his own story. But heroes do not spend their final hours hiding behind wooden walls. Minutes passed. Negotiations failed. The soldiers waited. Then someone made a decision that would end the standoff forever. Bundles of dry straw were pushed against one side of the barn. A torch touched the timber. At first, only thin ribbons of smoke curled into the night. Then flames spread rapidly across the weathered boards. Orange light flooded the darkness. The fire illuminated Booth through the cracks in the walls. Witnesses later said they could see him pacing, limping, clutching his carbine, searching desperately for a path that no longer existed. Outside, dozens of rifles followed every movement. The circle had finally closed. Then, a single shot rang out, not from Booth, from outside. Sergeant Boston Corbett had seen the assassin raise his weapon and fired through a gap in the burning wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He collapsed instantly. Soldiers rushed into the blazing barn. and dragged him into the cool morning air. The famous actor who had dreamed of eternal glory could no longer move. He struggled desperately for breath. His hands trembled. His eyes wandered across the awakening sky. One soldier bent close enough to hear his final whisper. Useless. He looked weakly toward his motionless hands. Useless. Moments later, John Wilkes Booth was dead. John Wilkes Booth was dead, not upon a grand stage before cheering crowds, but in the dirt beside a burning barn. Alone, broken, remembered forever. Not as a patriot, but as the assassin who murdered Abraham Lincoln. When the telegram reached Washington, an enormous sigh swept across the city. The hunt was over. Justice, imperfect though it was, had finally arrived. Church bells rang once again. Not in celebration, but in solemn acknowledgement that one terrible chapter had finally closed. Samuel read the bulletin twice before handing it to another customer. For days he had imagined Booth as some unstoppable phantom disappearing deeper into the wilderness. Now he understood something different. Every man, no matter how clever, eventually meets the consequences of his own choices. Life slowly returned to the streets. Carriages rolled once more along Pennsylvania Avenue. Markets reopened. Children laughed again. Yet nothing truly felt the same. Wherever Samuel sold newspapers, conversations inevitably returned to that terrible April night. I was there. My brother heard the shot. My father joined the search. Everyone possessed a fragment of the story. Samuel carried one of the most haunting fragments of all. He had seen President Lincoln smile. And only minutes later, he had watched the assassin disappear into history. Years became decades. The little newspaper boy became a husband, then a father, then an old man whose hair slowly turned the color of winter snow. Washington transformed around him. Horse-drawn wagons gave way to electric streetcars. New buildings rose where empty lots had once stood. Generations grew up knowing Lincoln only through portraits, statues, and history books. But Samuel remembered something no painting could ever capture: the warmth of Lincoln's smile, the excitement of the gathered crowd, the single crack that shattered the illusion that peace had finally arrived. Sometimes, late in the evening, his grandchildren would ask whether the stories were true. "Grandfather, were you really there?" Samuel would fall silent before answering. "I was." "Did you see President Lincoln?" A gentle smile always crossed his weathered face, for just a moment. Then his expression grew distant, as if he knew every burden this country carried, and chose kindness anyway. He never spoke much about Booth. Hatred, he believed, deserved as little room in memory as possible. Instead, he remembered courage, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of a leader whose final public evening had been filled not with anger, but with hope. And whenever Samuel walked past Ford's Theater in his later years, he always paused for a moment beneath the familiar brick walls. He would remove his hat, close his eyes, and remember the ordinary spring evening when he had been nothing more than a young newspaper boy waiting outside a theater. He had expected to witness the end of a comedy. Instead, he witnessed the end of an era, and he came to understand a truth that history repeats across every generation. Sometimes the loudest moments begin with a single sound. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are witnessed not by kings or generals, but by ordinary people whose memories become the final guardians of history itself. Years passed into generations, and generations into centuries, yet the story refused to fade. Long after the gunpowder had vanished from the air, long after the tears of April had dried, the memory of that single evening continued to echo through the heart of a nation. Samuel Brooks lived long enough to watch America rebuild itself. He watched veterans grow old. He watched children become parents. He watched new presidents swear the same solemn oath that Abraham Lincoln had carried with such quiet determination. Yet every spring, when April returned with its cool evenings and gentle breeze, he found himself walking the familiar streets of Washington. His feet always carried him to the same place, Ford's Theater. The city had changed, but the silence surrounding it had not. Visitors arrived from every corner of the country. Some came carrying flowers. Others removed their hats without speaking. Parents lifted young children into their arms and whispered the story of the president who had preserved the Union, only to lose his life when peace had finally arrived. Samuel never interrupted them. History belonged to everyone now, but hidden deep inside him remained a memory that belonged to him alone. The smile, not the speeches, not the statues, not the portraits, just one brief smile exchanged between the most powerful man in America and an ordinary newspaper boy standing on a wooden crate outside a theater. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, yet somehow it endured longer than an empire. In his final year, Samuel filled a small journal with memories before they could disappear with him. He wrote about the smell of fresh newspapers on cool mornings, the sound of carriage wheels over wet cobblestones, the laughter pouring from the theater moments before history changed forever. He carefully described the terrible crack of Booth's pistol, not because he wished to preserve violence, but because he believed future generations should understand how quickly peace can be stolen, and how fragile hope truly is. His grandchildren discovered the journal after his passing. Inside the final pages, they found words written in an increasingly unsteady hand. I have often wondered why I was there that evening. I was no soldier. I was no senator. I held no office. I simply sold newspapers. But perhaps history needs ordinary witnesses as much as extraordinary leaders. If no one remembers, then even the greatest sacrifice slowly disappears. Those words were copied, shared, and eventually preserved alongside countless other first-hand accounts of one of the darkest nights in American history. Today, visitors still walk through Ford's Theater. They stand beneath the balcony where Abraham Lincoln spent the last peaceful moments of his life. Most people pass by without realizing that history rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives disguised as an ordinary day, an ordinary shift at work, an ordinary walk through a familiar street, a boy hoping to sell one more newspaper before heading home. No one wakes believing they will witness a moment remembered for centuries, yet someone always does, and because they remember, the world remembers too. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln did not end with a single gunshot. It reshaped a grieving nation, accelerated the search for justice, and forever altered the course of American history. The man who fired the weapon achieved the notoriety he desperately sought, but not the legacy he imagined. His name became forever linked with betrayal, while Lincoln's became forever linked with sacrifice, reconciliation, and the unfinished promise of unity. As for Samuel Brooks, whether history remembers his name matters very little. His role was never to change events. His role was simply to see them, to carry them, to pass them forward. Without people like him, countless defining moments would dissolve into silence. Without witnesses, history becomes rumor. Without memory, even truth begins to fade. So tonight, as our journey comes to its quiet end, imagine one last time the warm glow of the gas lamps along 10th Street. The distant laughter drifting from Ford's theater, the steady clip of horses crossing the cobblestones, and a young newspaper boy standing patiently beneath the evening sky, unaware that within moments the world he knew would be changed forever. One smile, one shot, one witness, one memory carried across an entire lifetime. And perhaps that is history's greatest lesson. Empires rise, leaders fall, buildings crumble, generations pass into dust. But the stories we choose to remember, the courage we refuse to forget, and the quiet voices of ordinary people who stood at the edge of extraordinary moments can outlive them all. Thank you for spending this evening here. Until our next journey into the past, may your night be peaceful, your thoughts be gentle, and may the echoes of history remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always those who bear witness, so that the light is never witnessed, completely lost.